Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. Today, my friends, we are looking at Warzone's meta, but in sort of a different way than we've looked at it in the past. You know, usually when we're talking about the meta, we're breaking down the best weapons, the best loadouts, whether you want to use this assault rifle or this SMG or whatever the case may be. Today, though, we're sort of looking at the meta from a developer standpoint because recently, Raven sort of revealed why they nerf things, why they buff things, and how they go about their weapon tuning with, each major update. And this info, I feel like, is especially important right now because, of course, we just had the whole Season 3 update with all the major weapon tuning there, but at the same time, Raven also teased that we're going to get more weapon tuning in the future, potentially a nerf to the Amax, and specifically to the Amax nerf that I brought up in a few videos back. It seemed like for the most part, there were a lot of people in the comments freaking out about that, saying, why nerf the Amax? The Amax is really, really good. It's really balanced. Why are they nerfing another Modern Warfare weapon? What's the deal with all of this? And so we're sort of diving into that from a developer's perspective. Then also we're looking at what else might be nerfed in the future as well. Or buffed, potentially. You never know. As always, if you enjoy the video at any point, let me know by dropping a like on it. Goal for today is going to be 4,500 likes. Let's see if we can cross that. And of course, if you're new to the channel or if you haven't already subscribed, I am always covering everything going on in COD. News, intel, setups, you name it, it's all right here. So feel free to subscribe. That way you can always stay up to date. So the first bit of info that we're looking at today comes from the Video Games Chronicle, or VGC. We talk about them a lot in various videos. They're a pretty reputable news outlet for all sorts of gaming stuff, but they do talk about Call of Duty quite a bit. And this article specifically goes over quite a few things that has to do with Season 3. It's titled Warzone Interview. Verdansk 84 is just the beginning. There's a lot coming. So obviously they're teasing a lot of stuff happening in this season. And for the most part, there's a lot going on in this. They actually interview Amos Hodge and Miles Leslie. Amos Hodge from Raven and Miles Leslie from Treyarch. They're asking a bunch of different questions, things about the Warzone map, how it compares to the original, and, what's different in the revamp and whatnot. But what we want to focus on specifically, that's going to be down here at the very, very bottom of the interview, right here. So VGC actually asked that you're moving away from the current burst meta, at which point do you consider a gun to cross the line from popular to overpowered and requiring action? So basically, at what point do you say, hey, we got to nerf these weapons, we got to change something here, we have to add in some new weapon tuning? And to this, Amos responds with, that's a combination of things, but it's mostly data driven. And we can already stop and talk about this one sentence into this answer because especially as someone who covers loadouts and as someone who's pretty active within the community in terms of what's going on with the meta, what's changing and when, I get a lot of comments, whether it be in the actual videos or, over on Twitter or wherever else saying, why are you complaining about this gun? They're going to nerf it because of you. Or, hey, don't show that loadout. They're going to nerf it because of you. Contrary to popular belief, they're not nerfing things because, hey, a YouTuber says this, hey, a top player says this, hey, a streamer says that. While that is factoring into it, you could say it's data driven. So they have all these numbers that we don't necessarily have saying, hey, the Amax is doing this in 90% of games. Hey, the DMR is killing at this rate compared to all of these other weapons. They have a bunch of different back-end data that we'll never even be able to see, but we do have access to some stuff that we'll talk about later on in the video. But anyways, he says it's mostly data-driven. We actually have data so we know how many players are using each weapon, and we'll look at what players are putting in their loadout kits, collect that data, then we have a range where if above a certain percentage of players are using something, then it's out of control. So a lot of it comes down to, hey, if 60% of the player base is using this gun over everything else, there's probably a problem there, right? So that's a really, really important thing to take note of. They also say we have a range of not just each gun, but each class. Because if 80% of players were using SMGs, then we'd see that as a problem. So pretty much the example I just said. And then you can dig in and see, are the majority of those players using only one type of SMG? We really look at the numbers, and then we look at the community sentiment and take that into account too. So for instance, the DMR. That was obviously a huge problem back in Season 1, and they actually mentioned it later on in this interview. And I'll link this whole thing if you guys want to read it for yourselves. But obviously, when the DMR meta was going crazy, everyone was freaking out. You had NFL players talking about it. Every creator, every streamer was talking about it being broken. So on top of that being predominantly the most used weapon, it was overwhelmingly negative as far as the feedback goes in terms of the DMR meta and just how powerful it was. So they went ahead, they nerfed it into the ground, right? Or they attempted to. It took a couple of tries, but they got there. This pretty much goes on to say, like, they've got so many different weapons, there's always going to be some go-to weapons, but they want to make sure they change that up enough. We want to make sure that we're constantly changing that so the meta doesn't get stale and boring. If the meta was still the M4 from when we launched, it would be boring, which is very true. So basically, their goal here is to actually change the meta at least once a season, maybe even more than that if there's some really, really broken guns. They say our goal is to try and shift up the meta with every season launch. Then we'll fix bugs and try it out and let it set, see where it goes, and hopefully become stable and last for a good half a season. So like, the first couple of weeks of the season involve the initial, weapon tuning, the meta shifting, like we just saw in season 3. Now they're gonna sit there and say, okay, what are the weapons that everyone's using now? Is it balanced? Is it being overused? Is it overpowered in some way compared to other weapons? They're gonna let it sit for a little. They're gonna let it see what it does. And then they'll go ahead and start planning the next round of weapon tuning, which usually will happen like either at mid-season or with the next season. So it's always staying fresh, at least in that sense. We don't want it to sit for too long. Our goal is to change it every season launch. We might not always hit that because it's not like a science, it's an art. So like, for instance, they tried to nerf the DMR meta initially. They didn't nerf it well enough. They had to do it again. Same deal with the AUG and the M16 actually. But yeah, so basically that's their initial idea. That's the dev standpoint on why they're nerfing things, when they're nerfing things, and how they go about changing up the meta so it's not ridiculously boring and monotonous. So with that in mind, we also have WZ Ranked. This is like another Warzone stat website. They actually give us some really, really interesting details on loadouts in specific. So for instance, right on the front page here, you can see the meta for this week. Now, at the time I'm recording this, it's Monday, I think. So the data is from the last 7 days. Obviously, this will probably change in the coming days. I'm not sure what day exactly this video is going up, but the number one used weapon this week currently is the Kar 98K, which is actually down a little bit from before. You've got the Amax at number 2, which is now up because, of course, we don't have the ridiculous AUG or M16 or FFAR anymore. The FFAR is still pretty good though, so it's number 3. You've got the Mac 10 still at number 4, and then also the Farah 83, which is sort of rising in the ranks of popularity because everyone's figuring out that after the buff, it's now a really, really good weapon. You also have the KD ratio for certain weapons. So people have a pretty decent KD with the CR56 AMAX. I think like the above average, or average to above average, I should say, for KD generally is from 0.9 to 1.1. So people usually have an above average KD with the AMAX. Same deal with the AUG. The PPSH is kind of surprising because it's actually not that good. The Street Sweeper is rising up in there as well, and so is the Swiss K31 Sniper. But we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna look at the loadouts here. And this is actually a really important graph here. This is the meta coefficient, and the higher this gets, the less diversity there is. So the lower it gets, the better. The lower it gets, that means the more weapons are being used. It's not just like one weapon. You can see here, this is back in like June and July of 2020. This was around like the Grau and the Bruin meta, and pretty much everyone was using those guns. They ended up nerfing them, and the coefficient starts to drop. And this is like season 5, season 6, where the meta was a lot better. You had things like the Kilo, which was really viable. This was also the fire shotgun meta, unfortunately. But predominantly when the Kilo was the go-to rifle, that meta was pretty diverse and pretty open. And then you get the new seasons here once that finally gets added in, and it's a lot of DMRs. This is around the holidays when the DMR meta was going crazy. So we had the DMRs, the Type 63. Even recently, you can see it's pretty high up around that like 0.75, 0.79 area when it was a lot of the M16, a lot of the AUGs, so on and so forth. Then the update happened, and it drops pretty severely because now we have a much more diverse meta. So that's an important graph. Sort of ties in with this. The lower this is, technically the happier the devs are because they see that the meta is a lot more open and more people are using more weapons. But let's look at the popularity here, because this is probably the most important thing. This shows us the weapons that are being used a ton. And if we go back to that article where Raven said, where Amos said that they're going to look at what weapons are being overused and go from there, because they want to spice things up. They want to keep things entertaining and fresh so that everyone's not using the same 2 or 3 or 4 weapons. You can see the AMAX is up here at number 2 right now. It's up right now. It's got the high KD, and the popularity here is, the bar in comparison to most of these things is pretty high. Now the Kar is the number 1 spot, and I've seen a lot of people saying the Kar should be nerfed. On the other hand, I've also seen a lot of people saying the Kar should not be nerfed. However you feel about it, there's no denying it is the go-to sniper. It's the go-to marksman rifle. However, at the same time, it seems relatively well balanced, especially now because Sniper Glint is back for the Modern Warfare snipers. Yes, it is a one-shot headshot, but so is every other sniper in the game. It's not like a one hit to the body, but it does have that mobility. Its fire rate is pretty good. So you can make an argument for both sides, it being nerfed and not being nerfed. Regardless, though, it is very popular, and that more so than does it need to be nerfed, does it not need to be nerfed. leads me to believe that it could be nerfed in the future to spice up the sniper category, to try and get more people to use the SPR or the Tundra or the HDR or the Pellington or whatever other weapon. The Swiss is in there too. The FFAR is still pretty popular, but it is dropping. Same deal with the MAC-10, whereas you see the Ferris start to rise because now it's becoming one of those more usable weapons. Same deal with the Krig. The Kilo is sort of back in the mix, but it's not really on a rise or on a dip, just because people have been using the Kilo for quite some time. And actually, same deal with the Grau here. Because we no longer have the ridiculously powerful TAC rifles or the overpowered FFAR, a lot of other weapons like the Kilo and the Grau, which have really good range, really good bullet velocity, very minimal recoil, weapons that are generally very, very easy to use regardless of skill level, those are becoming a lot more popular now, and they're still sitting here in like the top 10 most used. The M16 is on a dip. You have things like the LC10 and the Bullfrog and the MP5 on the rise. So you can see that the meta is slowly shifting quite a bit here. You got a lot of up arrows and a lot of down arrows, which is generally healthy for the game, I would say, especially if we're looking at the meta from a dev standpoint. But specifically with the CAR, with the Amax, those are two weapons that are very popular. They've been very popular for a long time now. The Amax pretty much since launch, in the CAR ever since launch as well, I would say, actually. So these two, I would say, I would have on the chopping block in terms of popularity-based nerfs, whereas a lot of these other weapons right now, they're not ridiculously broken, they're not ridiculously underpowered per se, so they don't really have to get a nerf based off of that. There's nothing that's really breaking the meta in that sense. It's more so just a popularity battle at this point. But that said, well, of course, we're strictly talking nerfs here with things like the Amax. There's also a ton of guns down here that hardly ever get used, right? The Modern Warfare AK-47, the Modern Warfare AN-94, even right now the K-31, because it's not very good compared to the CAR. These are down here in the not so popular categories, and alongside a couple Cold War weapons, which we have, like the Type 63, which no one really uses anymore, some of the shotguns. We have a lot of Modern Warfare weapons, and it's sort of been like this since the Cold War integration. It seems like a lot of the Cold War weapons are getting a push, you could say, to try and force them into the meta, whereas you still have a lot of Modern Warfare weapons that are generally underutilized. Things like the SA-87, which is actually not all that bad. It's got some not so ideal recoil, but it hits like a truck. The FR556, which we just discovered was not the worst gun. I honestly hated it before that, but recently, because we found out that like the semi-auto isn't awful, the burst really isn't that bad in terms of recoil compared to some of the other burst weapons. This is a weapon that's not, you know, awful. You could use it. The AUG as an SMG is actually pretty good. So is the P90. So you got a lot of weapons that don't really get much attention. You could also talk the Odin, the Scar, things like that, that really aren't super popular in the meta. They could end up getting a buff. Same deal with some of the Cold War weapons. I think the QBZ could probably use a damage buff. You could talk the Stoner. You could talk the AK-74U to try and force them closer to weapons like the Krig, like the LC-10, the Bullfrog, so on and so forth. But yeah, overall, hopefully this helps you understand a bit more why certain things are nerfed, why certain things are buffed, and why certain things aren't touched. If there's a weapon that seems relatively well balanced, like the Kilo for quite some time now, like the Grau for quite some time now, and they're not being overused and abused, they're probably not going to get touched. Probably going to sit right in the meta and do their like usual thing. They're not going to break it. They're not going to be underutilized. They're just like a middle of the pack weapon, which we have quite a few of now. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed the video, let me know by dropping a like on it. And of course, if you're new to the channel, or if you haven't already subscribed, we are on the road to 750K, 750,000 subs. So if you want to help us get one step closer to hitting that milestone, feel free to subscribe. That way you can always stay up to date with everything going on in COD. Once again, and as always, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take it easy, have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace out.